In a world where the fate of an entire people can depend on the courage of a single individual, the story of Esther emerges, a young Jewish woman who became queen of Persia and saved her nation from annihilation. This extraordinary narrative of faith, courage, and divine providence continues to inspire generations, showing how God can use ordinary people to achieve extraordinary deeds. Get ready to embark on an exciting journey through corridors of power, palace intrigues, and decisions that change the course of history. In the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign, king of Persia, a great banquet was held in the citadel of Susa. Esther 1:1. 3 tells us this is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. This feast lasted an impressive 180 days, during which the king displayed the wealth of his kingdom and the splendor of his majesty. At the end of this period, as Esther 1:5 tells us, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days, for all the people who were in the citadel of Susa, from the least to the greatest. The palace was adorned with white and blue linens, and guests drank from golden goblets, each different from the other. On the 7th day of the banquet, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he commanded that Queen Vashti be brought into his presence. The king wished to show off Vashti's beauty to the nobles and everyone present, for she was very beautiful. However, something unexpected occurred. Esther 1:12 reveals, but when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. This refusal infuriated King Xerxes, who immediately consulted his wise men on what should be done. One of the advisors, named Memucan, suggested that Vashti be deposed from her position as queen. He argued that Vashti's behavior could negatively influence all the women in the kingdom. The king and the nobles agreed with this advice, and a decree was issued throughout the vast empire. Esther 1:19 says, "This therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree. And let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she." Thus Vashti was banished from the king's presence, leaving the throne of the queen vacant. After these events, when King Xerxes' anger subsided, he began to miss Vashti. His attendants, noticing this, made a suggestion. Esther 2:4 tells us, "Then the king's personal attendants proposed, 'Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. The young woman who pleases the king will become queen instead of Vashti.' This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. It was in this context that a young Jewish woman named Hadassah, also known as Esther, came into the picture. Esther was an orphan and had been raised by her cousin Mordecai. Esther 2:5-7 introduces her. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up, because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. When the king's decree was announced, Esther was taken to the king's palace, along with many other young women. Esther quickly gained the favor of Haggai, the man in charge of the harem. Esther 2:9 says, "She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants, selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Mordecai had instructed Esther not to reveal her nationality or family background, and she faithfully followed this advice. Each young woman underwent 12 months of beauty treatments before being presented to King Xerxes, When it was Esther's turn, she requested nothing but what Haggai suggested. Esther 2:15 tells us, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Finally, Esther was taken to the king. The book of Esther tells us that the king loved her more than all the other women, and that she won his favor more than any of the virgins. Thus, as Esther 2:17 states, the king was so pleased with Esther that he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate, the king gave a great banquet, known as Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He also declared a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal generosity. Esther, the Jewish orphan, was now queen of the vast Persian Empire. During this time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, a position suggesting some status in the royal court. It was there that he overheard two palace officials, Bigthana and Teresh, plotting to assassinate King Xerxes. Esther 2:22 tells us, but Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. The report was investigated and found to be true, and the two officials were hanged. This event was recorded in the royal chronicles in the presence of the king. Sometime later, King Xerxes decided to honor a man named Haman. Esther 3:1 tells us, after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman's son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. The king ordered all the royal officials at the king's gate to kneel down and honor Haman. However, Mordecai refused to kneel or pay him honor. The other royal officials at the king's gate noticed Mordecai's behavior and asked him why he disobeyed the king's command. Esther 3:4 says, day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel or pay him honor, he was enraged. When Haman discovered that Mordecai was a Jew, he was not satisfied with eliminating just Mordecai. Esther 3:6 reveals, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Haman then began to devise a plan to destroy all the Jews in Xerxes' empire. In the 12th year of Xerxes' reign, Haman cast the pyre, that is the lot, to determine the day and month for his plan. The lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman went to speak to the king. Esther 9 tells us what he said. There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. The king agreed to Haman's plan and gave him his signet ring, saying, "Keep the money and do with the people as you please." Thus, on the 13th day of the first month, dispatches were sent to all the provinces of the king. Esther 3:13 informs us of the contents of these dispatches. Letters were sent to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he was deeply distressed. Esther 4:1 tells us, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. In every province where the edict was issued, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai. Upon hearing this, she was deeply distressed. Esther 4:5-8 tells us, then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been proclaimed in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct Esther to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Thus, the stage was set for Esther to face her greatest challenge and fulfill her destiny. When Esther received the news about Haman's decree through Hathach, she found herself facing a great dilemma. The situation was extremely grave, as the book of Esther reveals in chapter 4, verse 11. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law: that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. This law put Esther in a very dangerous position. If she approached the king without being summoned, she could be killed immediately. On the other hand, if she did not go, her people would be destroyed. Esther was faced with an impossible choice: risk her own life or allow her people to be exterminated. In light of this danger, Esther sent a message to Mordecai explaining the situation. Mordecai, however, responded with strong and challenging words. In Esther 4, 1-14 we read, Mordecai sent this reply to Esther: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Mordecai's words were a powerful reminder to Esther that her position as queen was no accident, but possibly had a divine purpose. He challenged her to look beyond her own safety and consider the welfare of all her people. Mordecai's response also demonstrated unshakable faith that God would save his people, even if Esther chose not to act. Mordecai's words had a profound impact on Esther. She realized she could not remain silent in the face of the threat looming over her people. After reflecting on the situation, Esther made a courageous decision. She decided she would go to the king, even if it could cost her life. However, before doing so, she asked for the spiritual support of her people. In Esther 4:16, she says, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. Go, I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." This famous statement reflects Esther's courage and determination. She was willing to sacrifice her own life for the sake of her people. Her decision was not made lightly, but with full awareness of the risks involved. Esther's request for a fast was not merely a form of abstaining from food, but a profound expression of dependence on God. During those 3 days, the Jews surely prayed fervently, asking for divine intervention. Esther knew she would need supernatural strength to face the challenge ahead. She was not just risking her life, but carrying the fate of her entire people on her shoulders. The collective fast showed that Esther recognized the situation was beyond her own strength. She understood that she needed God's help and the unity of her people to succeed in her mission. This collective act of fasting also united the Jews in a common purpose, spiritually strengthening them for the events to come. After 3 days of fasting, the time had come for Esther to put her plan into action. The book of Esther, chapter 5, verse 1 tells us, "On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the palace in front of the king's hall." The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall. This was a moment of great tension. Esther was about to find out whether she would be accepted by the king or face immediate death. All the spiritual preparation over the past 3 days would be tested at this crucial moment. Esther must have felt her heart pounding as she walked towards the king's throne. Every step brought her closer to her destiny, whether it be life or death. Esther's courage in this moment is truly inspiring, for she was willing to risk everything for the sake of her people. To Esther's relief, the king received her favorably. Esther 5:2 says, "When he saw Queen Esther standing in the courtyard, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand." So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. This gesture from the king meant that Esther was safe and could speak. The king, seeing that Esther had come uninvited, realized that she must have something very important to discuss. He was willing to hear what she had to say. This moment of acceptance was crucial for Esther's plan. Had the king not extended the scepter, the entire story could have ended right there. The king's favorable response was the first step in the chain of events that would lead to the salvation of the Jewish people. We can imagine the relief and gratitude Esther must have felt at that moment. Surprisingly, instead of immediately presenting her request, Esther invited the king to a banquet. She said, as we read in Esther 5. 4. If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. The king quickly agreed and summoned Haman to join them at Esther's banquet. This strategy of Esther shows her wisdom. Rather than making her request directly, she first sought to create a favorable atmosphere and further win the king's favor. Esther understood that timing was crucial. She didn't want to rush things, but carefully prepared the ground for her request. By inviting Haman along with the king, Esther also kept her enemy close, where she could observe him. This tactic demonstrates Esther's intelligence and insight in navigating the complex politics of the court. During the banquet, the king asked Esther what her request was, promising to grant her up to half the kingdom if she so desired. But once again, Esther delayed her request. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to another banquet the following day, where she would then reveal her request. This tactic of Esther created suspense and heightened the king's curiosity, while at the same time giving Haman a false sense of security. Esther 5:8 tells us, "If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." By delaying her request, Esther was increasing the king's anticipation and ensuring that he would be fully focused when she finally revealed her petition. This strategy also gave time for providential events to unfold, which would ultimately help Esther's cause. That night after the first banquet, something unexpected happened. King Xerxes couldn't sleep. Esther 6:1 tells us that night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. This sleeplessness of the king was a providential event that would change the course of events. As the records were read to the king, he was reminded of something important he had forgotten. This moment of the king's insomnia seems to be a divine intervention, paving the way for the salvation of the Jews. It's interesting to note how God often works behind the scenes, using seemingly insignificant events to accomplish his purposes. The king's insomnia on that specific night was a crucial turning point in the story. The records mentioned how Mordecai had uncovered and reported a plot to assassinate the king. Xerxes asked what honor Mordecai had received for this act of loyalty and discovered that nothing had been done. Esther 6:3 says, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. This discovery must have made the king feel embarrassed for having neglected to reward someone who had saved his life. He immediately decided to correct this oversight. Just at that moment, Haman entered the palace courtyard. The king called him in and asked, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman, thinking the king wanted to honor him, suggested a grand public display of honor. This coincidence of Haman being present at that exact moment is another example of how events were providentially aligning. To Haman's shock and horror, the king ordered him to personally bestow all these honors on Mordecai, the man he hated most and had planned to kill. Esther 6:10-11 says, "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "You get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Read, this humiliating reversal for Haman was just the beginning of his downfall. We can imagine the shock and humiliation Haman must have felt as he had to publicly honor the man he planned to kill. This event not only elevated Mordecai in the eyes of the public, but also began to undermine Haman's position in the court. At the second banquet, the king again asked Esther what her request was. This time, Esther revealed her true intention. In Esther 7:3-4, she says, "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my request, and spare my people. This is my petition, for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." These words shocked the king, who asked who would dare do such a thing. Esther's revelation was dramatic and emotional. She finally exposed the threat hanging over her people and identified herself as one of them. Esther's courage at that moment is admirable. She risked everything to defend her people, trusting that the king would hear her plea. Esther then pointed directly to Haman, saying, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." The book of Esther tells us that Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Esther's revelation not only exposed Haman's wickedness, but also revealed that she herself was Jewish, a fact previously unknown in the court. This moment must have been shocking for everyone present. Haman, who just a day earlier was at the height of his power, now found himself exposed as a villain before the king. Esther's wisdom in waiting for the right moment to make her revelation proved crucial. She had carefully prepared the situation, ensuring the king would be receptive to her appeal. The king, furious at Haman's betrayal, got up and went to the palace garden. Haman, realizing the danger he was in, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. But when the king returned and saw Haman fallen on the couch where Esther was reclining, his anger grew even more. Esther 7:8 tells us just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the king said this, they covered Haman's face, a sign that he was condemned. The king's wrath against Haman was evident. The man whom he had trusted and elevated to a position of power was now seen as a traitor and a threat. Haman's downfall was as swift as his rise. One of the eunuchs present, named Harbona, informed the king about the gallows Haman had built, 75 feet high, for Mordecai. The king then gave his final sentence: hang him on it. Esther 7:10 concludes, "So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai." This dramatic reversal not only saved Mordecai's life, but also marked the beginning of the deliverance of the Jewish people. The irony of the situation is striking. Haman was executed on the very gallows he had prepared for his enemy. This outcome serves as a powerful reminder that evil often turns back on those who practice it. Justice prevailed in a way that no one could have predicted. Haman's fall was as swift as his rise. In a matter of hours, he went from being the most powerful man in the kingdom, second only to the king, to a condemned traitor. This reversal reminds us of how quickly circumstances can change and how justice can prevail in unexpected ways. Esther's courage, Mordecai's loyalty and divine providence all came together to bring about an outcome that seemed impossible just days earlier. The story of Esther teaches us about the importance of courage, faith, and taking action at the right moment. It shows how God can use ordinary people, placed in strategic positions, to fulfill his purposes and protect his people. With Haman's execution, Esther and Mordecai gained favor with King Xerxes. Esther 8. 1-2 tells us that same day King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. This act of the king demonstrated not only his trust in Esther and Mordecai, but also his willingness to correct the wrongs that had been planned against the Jews. Mordecai's rise to the position formerly held by Haman was a remarkable turnaround, showing how God can dramatically change circumstances. Despite this initial victory, Haman's decree to destroy the Jews was still in effect. Esther once again courageously approached the king to intercede for her people. Esther 8, 3-6 describes her emotional appeal. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor, and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces." Esther's plea demonstrates her continued bravery and unwavering dedication to her people. King Xerxes responded favorably to Esther's request, but explained that a law signed with the royal seal could not be revoked. However, he offered an alternative solution. Esther 8 says, "Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring." For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. The king's response opened the way for a new strategy to save the Jews. While the original decree could not be undone, a new decree could be issued to counteract its effects. This situation reminds us that sometimes, when faced with seemingly insurmountable obstacles, we need to seek creative and alternative solutions. With the authority granted by the king, Mordecai immediately acted to create a new decree. Esther 8, 9. 11 describes the content of this new edict. The king's scribes were summoned at that time on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all of Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script and language of each people, and also in the script and language of the Jews. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses bred from the royal stud. The king's decree granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed forces of any nationality or province that might attack them, including women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. This new decree essentially gave the Jews the right to defend themselves against any attack. It was a complete reversal of the previous situation, where the Jews had been defenseless against the threat of annihilation. The announcement of this new decree brought great joy and relief to the Jewish community throughout the Persian Empire. Esther 8, 1-6-17 describes their reaction. For the Jews it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city where the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews, because fear of the Jews had seized them. This celebration not only marked relief from the immediate threat, but also strengthened the identity and unity of the Jewish people throughout the diaspora. When the day designated in Haman's original decree arrived, the Jews were prepared to defend themselves. Esther 9:1-2 tells us on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. No one could stand against them, because the fear of the Jews had fallen on all the people. The Jews' victory over their enemies was complete, demonstrating how God had entirely reversed their situation, turning a day meant for their destruction into a day of triumph. The Jewish victory was so significant that the king extended the defense period by another day in Susa, the capital. Esther 9:1-5-16 reports, "The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder." Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This overwhelming victory not only protected the Jews, but also established a strong deterrent against future attacks. The decision not to take their enemies' property showed that the Jews were acting in self-defense, not out of greed or revenge. To commemorate this great deliverance, Mordecai established a new festival called Purim. Esther 9:20-22 explains, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. The establishment of Purim was not only a celebration of the past victory, but also a way to preserve the memory of these events for future generations, ensuring that the Jewish people would never forget how God had delivered them. The name Purim comes from the word pur, which means lot, referring to how Haman had cast lots to choose the day for the Jews' destruction. Esther 9:26 explains, therefore these days were called Purim from the word pur. The irony of this name was not lost. What was meant to be a day of destruction, determined by chance, became a day of celebration and remembrance of divine providence. The festival of Purim became an integral part of Jewish culture and tradition, celebrated to this day. During Purim, the book of Esther is read in synagogues, reminding the Jewish people of their deliverance and God's faithfulness. With the threat against the Jews eliminated and the festival of Purim established, Mordecai was elevated to a position of great power in the kingdom. Esther 10:3 summarizes his rise and character. HTTP is Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Mordecai's elevation to this position of authority not only ensured the continued safety of the Jews in the Persian Empire, but also demonstrated how God can elevate those who remain faithful to him and his people, even in difficult circumstances. The legacy of Esther and Mordecai extended far beyond their time. Esther's story became a source of inspiration and encouragement for the Jewish people throughout the centuries, especially in times of persecution and adversity. Esther's courage in risking her life for her people, Mordecai's wisdom in advising and guiding Esther, and their faithfulness to God in the face of danger, became models of faith and action for generations of Jews and non-Jews alike. The narrative of Esther reminds us that God often works behind the scenes of history, using ordinary people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes. The story of Esther also holds special significance as an example of female leadership in ancient times. In an era and culture where women generally had little power or public influence, Esther emerged as a central figure in the salvation of her people. Her courage, wisdom, and decisive action demonstrate that God can use anyone, regardless of gender, social position, or circumstances, to accomplish his will. Esther's example continues to inspire women of faith to take on leadership roles and to use their influence for the good of others. The narrative of Esther also invites us to reflect on the role of destiny or divine providence in history. Although God's name is not explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther, his guiding hand is evident throughout the story. Esther's rise to the position of queen, Mordecai's discovery of the plot against the king's sleepless night that led to Mordecai's honor, and the dramatic reversal of the Jews' fortune, all these events point to God's work behind the scenes. This perspective encourages us to trust in divine providence in our own lives, even when we cannot clearly see how God is working. The lasting impact of Esther's story on Jewish culture is evident not only in the annual celebration of Purim, but also in how it has shaped the identity and resilience of the Jewish people. The narrative of Esther provided hope and encouragement for Jews in times of exile, persecution, and adversity throughout history. It serves as a powerful reminder that God does not abandon his people, even when circumstances seem bleak. The story also emphasizes the importance of unity and collective action within the Jewish community, as seen in their shared fasting and mutual defense against their enemies. Esther's story also teaches us valuable lessons about courage, faith, and action. Esther demonstrated extraordinary courage by approaching the king uninvited, risking her life for the sake of her people. Her famous declaration, "If I perish, I perish," illustrates a willingness to sacrifice everything for what is right. At the same time, the story shows us the importance of active faith. Esther did not only pray and fast, but she also acted decisively. This combination of faith and action serves as a model for all of us to face challenges in our own lives. The book of Esther also provides insights into the nature of power and its responsible use. We see how Haman abused his authority for selfish and evil purposes, while Esther and Mordecai used their positions of influence for the good of others. This contrast reminds us of the responsibility that comes with power and influence. And it challenges us to use whatever authority we may have for the benefit of others, rather than for personal gain. Mordecai's rise to the position of second in command in the kingdom demonstrates how integrity and selfless service can lead to positive and lasting influence. In conclusion, the story of Esther is a powerful narrative of courage, faith, and divine providence that continues to resonate with people from all walks of life. It reminds us that each of us can play a significant role in God's plan, regardless of our circumstances. The story encourages us to remain faithful to our faith and identity, even in hostile environments, and to be willing to stand up for what is right, even when it involves personal risks. Dear viewers, the story of Esther is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. It challenges us to consider, what Hamans do we face in our society today? Where can we be Esthers in our own spheres of influence? How can we use our position, no matter how humble, to make a difference in the lives of others? Reflect on these questions and consider how you can apply the lessons of Esther's courage, faith, and action in your own life. If you were inspired by this story and want to learn more about biblical characters who changed the course of history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Share this video with friends and family who may benefit from these powerful lessons. Together we can continue exploring the rich truths of Scripture and discover how they can transform our lives today. See you in the next video, where we will continue our journey through the inspiring stories of the Bible.